Hello and welcome to
Wednesday's Night Out.
with your host Joseph, Turnpike Plaza 365 Rec Squad.
Quotes that will change your life. A curated collection of mind-blowing wisdom. Edited by Russ Kick. About half of the U.S. public, 49%, says they have had a religious or mystical experience, defined as a moment of sudden religion, insight, or awakening. This is similar to a survey conducted in 2006, but much higher than in surveys conducted in 1976 and 1994, and more than twice as high as in a 1962 Gallup survey, 22%. In fact, the 2009 Pew Forum survey finds that religious and mystical experiences are more common today among those who are unaffiliated with any particular religion, 30%, than they were in the 1960s among the public as a whole, 22%. Pew Research Center, 2009.
The Dive from Clausen's Pier by Ann Packer. Chapter 18. Simon lived a busy life. Drinks after work, dinners, movies. If he didn't have plans, he generally stayed late at the law firm, which meant free Chinese delivered to the office and a cab home when he was tired, not to mention overtime for the extra hours he worked. Proofreading paid seriously well, and given his low rent, he had a lot of expendable income. It wasn't unusual for him to see a couple of plays in 1 week, then go to a concert on Friday night, and out dancing on Saturday. I was always welcome, but I was afraid to spend the money. And I was, generally, with Kilroy anyway. One evening, when I hadn't seen Simon in about a week, he sought me out on the third floor and asked me to go to a gallery opening with him. There'll be free food, he said. I won't take no for an answer. It's not that you want to do something with me, I teased him. You just want to make sure I don't starve to death. He shook his head adamantly. I want to make sure I don't starve to death. He reached for my hand. And I do want to do something with you, which hasn't been that easy, you know? You're not exactly around a lot, my dear. We got ready and then made our way down the street. It was early evening, the colorless sky just graying. We crossed 9th Avenue and then strolled down a block of neatly kept townhouses until we came abreast of my dirty, unused car. There it sat, parked under a ginkgo tree. I never drove it except to move it from one parking place to another. I was constantly racing out of the brownstone in order to obey the system of rules controlling when you could park there. Park where? Poor car, I said, giving it a pat as we passed by. It does look a little sad. I guess I should have taken the train. Simon shook his head vehemently. That wouldn't have been nearly so satisfying. He loved the story of my flight. He loved how long it had taken me to let anyone know where I was. Driving was perfect, he added. You needed to see Madison in your rearview mirror. It was dark, metaphorically speaking. He reached up and scratched the back of his head. Maybe you should sell it, he said casually. Too casually. I thought as if he'd been waiting for the opportunity. But I couldn't sell it. No way. It wasn't much of a car, and I certainly didn't need it right now, but I couldn't possibly sell it without telling Mike. And telling Mike I'd sold it would be like telling him I'd decided to have a dog we'd adopted together put to sleep. It's a good little car, he said the day I bought it. It'll last, or it'll have me to answer to. Simon was watching me. Alternate side of the street parking is really a pain when it snows, he said. He smiled gently. And the fact that snow would come, the fact that time would pass, and I might still be here, and I might not, made me tense with anxiety. At 8th Avenue, we headed downtown, past overflowing garbage cans and great stacks of flattened cardboard. There were so many restaurants, Italian, Japanese, Scandinavian, and Spanish, and Tex-Mex. There were places for hearty casserole, places for delicate salads and barely cooked fish, and barely cooked fish. A delicious smell of grilled meat drifted from an open door, and I turned and saw a neon sign that said Butch. There's a place on 9th called Femi, Simon said, and then with a grin, just kidding. At 19th Street, we waited for the light and then crossed. The urgent rumble of a subway train rose through the sidewalk grates. and I realized I was getting used to New York. When I first arrived, that sound had spooked me. The gallery was in a storefront on 16th Street. At the door, a guy about our age, tall and skinny, pale, with a shaved head, glanced idly but surely at everyone who entered. An art world bouncer. Simon whispered as we waited to go in. Beware his deadly look of contempt. Inside, a few dozen people milled around under hot tack, hot track lights, not paying much attention to the pictures. They were photographs of chairs, kitchen chairs, armchairs, lawn chairs, all in black and white, all composed so the chair was alone in the frame and empty. We moved along one wall, studied a picture of a bentwood chair with a cane seat, another of a worn out velvet armchair with a matching ottoman, its nap rubbed away. These are great, don't you think? Simon said. It's like they're waiting for something. I like them too. How they conjured up rooms, whole worlds. But I couldn't help thinking of the rehab poster back in Madison. The wheelchair casting its net of shadow onto the polished wood floor. Get moving. A couple came up behind us, and I looked over my shoulder at them. The woman was tiny, with masses of curly dark hair. She wore a wine-colored dress that looked as if it were made of crumpled paper. Her companion was a ponytailed man wearing a black cashmere sweater tucked into voluminously pleated black wool pants. He said to her, "There's an interesting decontextualization going on, don't you think?" He extended his finger and outlined the shape of the chair. It's about forms and negative space. She's taken the chairness away from the chair and left it purely object. Simon dug his elbow into my side, then grabbed me and pulled me across the room. "Don't you love New York?" he said. "You hear the best things." He shrugged off his jacket and glanced around. "How do you take the chairness away from a chair?" "You must have to do it in stages," I said. "First take the seatness away from the seat and move on from there." We stood in a pocket of space near the back of the gallery. The lights were so hot I took my jacket off too. Voices of laughter bounced off the white walls, and scraps of conversation floated by. A cunning little Kandinsky sort of a cross between Sarah McClellan and Philip Glass. Do they still go to Fire Island? Near us, a large auburn-haired woman in a multi-layered green dress glanced down at her mixed metal necklace, saw that the pendant had turned upside down, and quickly righted it with a look around to see if anyone was watching. Everyone looked as if they thought they were being looked at. Something self-conscious in the set of the shoulders. Simon ushered me to the bar, and we each got a glass of wine. Did you see the hors d'oeuvres tray before? He said. The shrimp looked good. We leaned against the wall. In the center of the room stood a short woman with a hind crew cut, her skin fair and so translucent I could see the vein in her temple like a light blue twig painted on porcelain. The artist, Simon said. How do you know? Can't you feel the vibe? I watched her smile at a portly man with thick white hair. Say something close to someone else's ear. Then reach over and touch the sleeve of a wraith-like woman walking past. No, I said. Simon smiled. Just kidding. I saw a portrait of her in another show. Photographers, and on photographers. It was actually kind of funny. And at least half of them you could tell the subject looked worse in the pictures than they would in real life. Like you're my competitor. So I'm going to dogify you. Dogify? I said. Make dog-like, with that kind of here's the brutally honest photographer turning his unpitying eye on real life type thing. Was she dogified? Completely, Simon said. Houndified, muddified. The picture was lit from the top, and you could see her scalp between her hairs, like bare ground where someone planted grass from seed. I smiled. That's the West Consonant in you talking. He clapped his hand to his mouth. I told him to keep quiet tonight. We went back to the bar for more wine. Then happened onto three separate waiters with hors d'oeuvres trays, huge shrimp, little rounds of potato topped with sour cream and caviar, bits of puff pastry covered with crumbled goat cheese. Minutes later, we were standing there, wiping our mouths, holding toothpicks we didn't know what to do with. 5 more of each of those, Simon said, and I'd feel like I'd had dinner. We moved toward a picture of a canvas director's chair. 2 of its legs sitting in an inch or so of foamy water, the other 2 pressing into dark, wet-looking sand. The canvas itself was droopy. The impression of someone's butt and back still there suggested it's like he just went in for one last swim, said Simon. God, I was thinking of something completely different. He looked at me. What? That it had been left behind after the summer was over. I shrugged. You know, abandoned. He raised his eyebrows. Art as Rorschach's test. I guess so. Simon Tall came. I guess so. Someone tall came and stood behind us. I felt him more than saw him. I was aware of Simon glancing back over his shoulder. Then something in the air changed and he was exclaiming, "Oh, Dylan. Hi. It's Simon, Kyle's friend. Hi, how are you?" I turned and saw that his cheeks were pink and that he was looking up at a man with beautiful bone structure and extraordinary silver blue eyes. This was a man from a movie, from a cologne ad. Stunning, a bit bored looking, with a mouth that wasn't supposed to smile. He nodded vaguely, but didn't speak. "Aren't you Kyle Donahue's friend?" Simon continued. "I work with him. I'm sorry. I think we met." He was blushing deeply now, his fingers playing with the button on his jacket cuff. The man just stood there. At last, he nodded. "That's right." Simon nodded too. "So this is Carrie. We were just looking at the photographs." He waved his hand in the man's direction. "This is Dylan," he said to me. "Nice to meet you, Dylan." "Nice to meet you," Dylan said flatly. He looked at Simon. "Do you know Renata?" Simon shook his head. Renata was the photographer. Renata Benyon. Her name was on the wall in pale gray paint. "I liked her last show better," Dylan said. "Oh, with the old people?" Dylan lifted a shoulder. "I thought of them more compositionally. They weren't people so much as forms of shadow and light." "Oh, that's really interesting," Simon said. I looked away. What were Mike's words? Pretentious and jaded. What Simon had found comical before, he was dishing out himself now, or lapping up anyway. And this guy was clearly an asshole. gorgeous but an asshole. Speaking of shadow and light, Simon went on. Have you seen Spectacular Creatures? Spectacular Creatures was a movie I'd overheard him and his friends talking about a few evenings ago. It had been the subject of at least 3 newspaper articles I had read. A low-budget, independent movie that had won prizes at a bunch of film festivals. Apparently, the director had gone to Yale, years ahead of Simon and his friends, but they talked about him with a kind of reverential intimacy. Apparently, the lighting is really interesting, he said. Now, I saw it last night, Dylan said. A look of disappointment passed fleetly over Simon's face. Oh, how was it? Dylan looked at his watch, then glanced around the gallery. At last, as if as an afterthought, he looked at Simon again. Okay, I wouldn't say that lighting is really interesting, but the costuming is quite good. Huh? Simon said. It highlights the absence of sexuality in a pretty interesting way. Actually, the whole thing is very anti-sexual, but subtextually, of course. Simon nodded seriously, sort of like his last movie, how drugs took the place of sex. Exactly, Dylan said. In 20 years, he'll be the Fellaini of abstinence. And Swig Lawler will be his Marcello Mastroianni. Simon smiled. His Marcello Mastroianni, and his Gulant Massena. Dylan laughed, and Simon said in a rush, hey, maybe we should have a drink sometime. There was an awkward silence. Maybe, Dylan said doubtfully. I'm pretty busy. He glanced around the gallery. I mean, get my number from Kyle if you want, and we'll see if we can figure something out. He looked at his watch again, and this time feigned surprise. Oh, I have to get going. Bye, Simon said. But Dylan was already moving away, that vague look on his face back again, as if to suggest it wasn't rudeness that kept him from saying goodbye, but simply an unavoidable preoccupation with something else. Oh, Simon said. What's oi? He smiled. God, you're Goyish. It's Jewish for Jesus. Fucking Christ. That was mortifying. You're not Jewish, I said. Honorarily, he said. which is all that counts. He smiled. Benjamin's Jewish. Benjamin was his ex, prominently his ex. He'd told me that the night I arrived, he took my arm and led me in the opposite direction from the one Dylan had taken. Did I just make the most gigantic fool of myself? Hey, maybe we should have a drink sometime. Like, I'm not sure I revealed the depth of my uncoolness yet. Let's try this. Simon. He leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. Nearby, the interesting decontextualization guy had a hand over one ear while he bowed his shoulders against the crowd and tried to talk on a cell phone. Totally mortifying, Simon said. I'm the biggest idiot in the world. Across the gallery, I saw Dylan in the middle of the crowd, bent close to a blond man with deeply tanned skin. Do you want to go? We can't, Simon said. It would look like I was slinking away. We turned back to the pictures and continued our tour of the gallery, napping hors d'oeuvres when we could. 15 or 20 minutes later, we were at the door. Dylan had vanished, whether into the crowd or from the gallery. I couldn't tell. Gloomily, Simon put his jacket back on, and I followed suit. I looked outside and saw that it was true dark now. My theory, Simon said, is that you measure your arrival in New York by when you stop looking at other people and start assuming they're looking at you. I laughed. He wore a gray sweater over twill pants, a virtual uniform for invisibility, and I wasn't much better. Black sweater, black pants, silver teardrop earrings, and I don't know what to wear outfit. You could be visible, I said. You just have to cultivate a more flamboyant look. I grabbed a handful of his plain zippered black jacket and pulled it stylishly tight. He shook my hand off. It's not clothes, it's attitude. An older woman came in just then, her hair in a perfect gray page boy, her lips a deep, dark red. She took off her coat, and I stared at her velvet dress, slate blue and tied at the side, the hemline angling up in front to reveal a thin crepe underskirt of the same color. It was gorgeous, set off perfectly by sheer gray blue stockings and matching thick-heeled gray blue suede pumps. It's also clothes, I said. The Dive from Clausen's Pier by Ann Packard. Turnpike Plaza, 365, Rec Squad.